welcome back to the Backyard Professor videos. I'm in one of my favorite spots up here by Kep's Crossing. Found me a real nice big rock to sit on. I'm going to share a story with you out of one of my very most favorite books, amazingly on calculus. Before you turn the video off, give this a chance. This guy is excellent. This is by Ben Orlin, brand new. It's called Change is the Only Constant. The Wisdom of Calculus in a Madcap World. This guy is funny, and he is profoundly philosophical, interestingly historical, and he has some great sociological ideas to share with us in this book. I laughed every page. I'm not kidding, this guy is hilarious. It's interesting because it's a book on calculus. Ben Orlin, he also wrote the book Math with Bad Drawings. His cartoons are horrid. They're funny though. There's one of his cartoons. That's the calculus integral. That little red guy right there. He'll talk about that. This is an excellent book. I would highly recommend it to you. What I want to do is share a story with you that he talks about in a profoundly historical theme. There's not one mathematical calculation in this entire book. Instead of showing you how to do calculus, he is explaining what is calculus about, the concept. How do we use it in our everyday world? And we use it for trillions of things. Our world couldn't possibly happen. Our particular cultural world, I'll put it that way, without calculus. And yet I read it cover to cover, my first setting, and it was so good that the next day I read it cover to cover again. I could not put it down, and I just laughed like crazy, and I was astonished at how much history, how much philosophy, and how much calculus I really learned. So come with me on this story. I'm going to read a selection from Ben Orlin. Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace is an achievement so grand, so sweeping, and so back-breakingly long that more than 150 years after its publications, the first readers are now just finishing it up. What a way to open a chapter. They seem impressed. If the world would write like Tolstoy, could write by itself, wrote journalist and radical Isaac Babel, it would write like Tolstoy. Buried among the novel's 6 bajillion pages are Tolstoy's thought on the project itself, on what it means to write the history of a whole civilization. And his choice of metaphor, well, let's just say it's going to surprise the casual reader. And this is what struck me. This is pure genius, as far as I'm concerned. To study the laws of history, we must completely change the subject of our observation. We must leave aside the kings, the ministers, and generals, and study the common, infinitesimally small elements by which the masses are moved. That peculiar mathematical phrase, infinitesimally small elements, in infinite array, that's no slip of the tongue of Tolstoy. Tolstoy is talking about integrals. Consider a battle. 2 armies meet. One will win. Military science, says Tolstoy, assumes that the relative strength of forces is identical with their numerical proportions. The army of 10,000 is twice as strong as the army of 5,000. It's 10 times stronger than the army of 1,000, and 1,000 times stronger than the 10 college freshmen caught up in a fraternity hazing ritual. So the numbers would dictate. But Tolstoy scoffs. He draws an analogy to physics. Very interesting here. Which cannonball exerts a greater force is the question before us. The one with a mass of 10 kilograms or of 5 kilograms? Well, clearly, it depends on how fast they're moving. If I cannon blast the lighter one, and yet I only granny bowl the heavier one, then the weight difference is irrelevant. The lighter object is overpowering. The heavier one, harmless. What's true of cannonballs also holds for the people firing them. Strength is about more than just size. In warfare, says Tolstoy, the force of armies is the product of the mass multiplied by something else, an unknown X. What exactly is X? It is, in Tolstoy's analysis, the spirit of an army. The greater or lesser desire to fight and to face dangers. When 500 skittish and uncommitted soldiers go up against 400 fierce and devoted ones, you know who to bet on. In essence, Tolstoy is asking us to imagine each army as a rectangle. Instead of base times height, we are computing mass times spirit. Whichever has the larger total, in other words, the larger area, is the most powerful army. But not all soldiers are alike. Some thrive in battle, some tremble, and some suffer immediate capture, necessitating costly rescue missions. Matt Damon. How can our mathematics reflect that diversity? We'll need to abandon the simplistic geometry of the single rectangle in favor of a complicated aggregate of rectangles. Tolstoy would gripe that I'm thinking in discrete terms about a continuous world. But it's not just me. This is the lazy and nefarious habit of all historians, whose profession is to break reality into arbitrary pieces. The leader versus that follower. This effect versus that cause. This punch versus that broken nose. These are only capricious cuts in the continuum of true history. We might as well label fragments of ocean or carve out pieces of wind. An army's strength is not in 100 small things, or 1,000 smaller things, or even 1,000,000 even smaller things. In Tolstoy's view, you need an infinite small unit for observation, a differential of history. An army's strength is an integral This interesting theory goes beyond specific battleground outcomes. The book ain't skirmishing peace. Tolstoy's integral encompasses life and death, good and evil, chocolate and vanilla, the entrance and exit of every nation ever to take the world stage. To understand history is to perform a tremendous act of calculus, to become not a Herodotus, but a Newton. And if this sounds like a radical, ambitious, and hard to implement theory of history, then ding, 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 3 points for the skeptic. Yeah. To be clear, Tolstoy didn't want to claim to have all of the answers. Of course not. He simply felt that history, in its current state, was a steaming heap of nonsense. Western historiography began, more or less, in the 5th century BC with the publication of Herodotus's history. In an ambitious opening paragraph, Herodotus names the game to create a record of events perpetrated by great men, which could both explain the cause of their waging war and ensure that great and marvelous deeds do not lose their victory, their glory. Tolstoy, bursting in on the conversation 2 millennia later, deems this entire project a spectacular waste of time. History is nothing but a collection of fables and useless trifles, cluttered up with a mass of unnecessary figures and proper names. The death of Igor, the snake bit Oleg's leg. What is all this but old wives' tales? According to Tolstoy, Herodotus and his followers committed a threefold error. You may want to grab some popcorn for this angry, disdainful Tolstoy, because it's a super fun Tolstoy also. First, the folly of the idea of events. Historians tend to pluck out a handful of occurrences, coronation, battle, dance-off, treaty, etc. And then they examine each one of these events as if it's the entire story. In reality, counters Tolstoy, there is not and cannot be a beginning to any event. But one event flows without any break in continuity from another, constantly flowing. Second, and even more offensive, historians dwell on the actions of great men, as if Napoleon's genius or Alexander's caution can explain the movements of the masses. Tolstoy finds this jaw-droppingly naive. It's almost unworthy of a venomous refutation. For example, really look at the phenomena of war. People leave their homes and families. They march hundreds of miles to kill foreigners, or else to die at their hands. They slaughter, and they in turn are slaughtered. And why? Wouldn't they rather stay home and play cards? What force moves them to join this bizarre spectacle, this crime against reason? War. What is it good for? To Tolstoy, the historian's great men explanations, these are pathetic. Only half a step above invoking Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. You might as well attribute a mountain's erosion to a dude with a shovel. The great men of history, says Tolstoy, these are not causes, They are effects. They ride atop the waves, deluding themselves and historians that they somehow steer. The king, says Tolstoy, is a slave of history. And the historian who speaks of the king's impact is like a deaf man answering questions which no one has ever asked him. Third and finally is this idea, this folly of cause. The whole project of history is to identify the specific reasons why events occur. To Tolstoy, this is a dead end, a fool's errand. It doesn't matter what causes you select, kings and generals, long-form journalism, Silicon Valley disruptors. The sheer number of plausible causes reveals the inadequacy of any single one. The more deeply we search out the causes, the more of them we discover, and every cause strikes us as being equally true in itself and equally deceptive through its insignificance with the immensity of the result and its inability to produce, without all of the other causes that occurred with it, the effect that followed. The dopey historian looks for one-dimensional explanations of infinite-dimensional effects. It's a failure to understand the multiplicity, the thickness of history, like plucking out a few grains of sand as the cause of the sand dune. Long story short, Tolstoy sees the historian as a self-deluded tale-teller whose conclusions can, without the slightest effort on the part of the critic, be dissipated like dust, which leaves no trace. Well, I, for one, admire the unblinking savagery of Tolstoy's attack. In the age before rap battles and Twitter feuds, this was no doubt the juiciest thing on television. But demolitions are easy. What does Tolstoy propose to build up from the rubble? Well, Tolstoy knew where history must begin, with the tiny fleeting data of human experience. A surge of courage, a flash of doubt, a sudden lust for nachos, that interior spiritual stuff. This is the only kind of reality that actually matters. Furthermore, Tolstoy knew where history must end, with grand, all-encompassing laws, explanations as tremendous as what they seek to explain. The only question is, what comes between? How do we get from the infinitely small to the unimaginably huge? From tiny acts of free will to the unstoppable motions of history. Though he couldn't fill the gap himself, Tolstoy sensed what kind of thing should go there. Something scientific and predictive. Something definite and indisputable. Something that aggregates, that unifies, that binds tiny pieces into a single whole. Something very akin to Newton's law of gravitation, something modern and quantitative, something like, an integral. Consider, for instance, the mathematical fact that no single point affects the outcome of an integral. What better way to express Tolstoy's insistence that great men do not matter. One single dot does not affect the entire integral, the entire graph under that curve. What better way to show how removing any person, great or small, from the stream of history would not alter its flow? Tolstoy admired what calculus had done in the study of mechanics. For the human mind, he wrote, the absolute continuity of motion is inconceivable, and that is why we're suckered in by Zeno's paradoxes. Yeah. Calculus, which the human intellect cannot make, by assuming infinite small quantities, corrects the inevitable error, which the human intellect cannot make. By analogy, historians are like cheeky little Zenos, chopping up the fluid timeline into arbitrary, disconnected events. Calculus, Tolstoy believed, could correct our cognitive shortcomings, restoring the unity and the continuity of history. I can imagine a happy ending to this little tale. War and Peace is published. The foolish old historians read its scorching prose. They then shriek and they crumble to dust. And new calculus-savvy historians rise to claim their office furniture. These fresh-minded right thinkers quantify the differential of history and develop a definitive theory of historical change. Huzzah! Profound laws are revealed and verified. The great men of history read these laws. They shriek and crumble to dust. Peasants rise to claim their office furniture. Nobel prizes abound and we all live happily ever after. Sadly, that's not how the last 150 years have gone. Nobody these days really expects to uncover deterministic laws of history. Instead, we imagine the sciences as falling along a rough continuum from the hard, like, say, math and physics, to the soft, like psychology and sociology. In their more insufferable moods, the hard sciences like to boast and crow, as if hard means complicated and soft means simple. This is, of course, exactly backwards. The softer the science, the more complex its phenomena. Physicists can predict what atoms will do. But gather enough atoms, and the calculations grow unwieldy. We need new emergent laws, chemical laws. Then gather enough chemicals, and complexity overwhelms us again. We need biology to step in with new theories and rules, and so on down the line. At each tipping point, the role of math evolves. From certain to tentative, from deterministic to statistical, from consensus to controversy, simple phenomenon like quarks follow mathematical rules with slavish fidelity, complex phenomena like toddlers less so. So what is Tolstoy asking for? Oh, not much. Only for the most complex phenomenon to fall under the most rigid mathematical laws. Yeah. Only for people to be planets. Suffice it to say, we're still waiting for that theory, right? Well, there is a fissure in Tolstoy, though. On one side is his knack for detail, his gift for capturing the effervescent data of daily life. On the other side is his yearning for big, bold answers. What steers human events? Why war? Why peace? The integral is the bridge between Tolstoy's gift and his dream. It's supposed to reconcile the world he knows, a jumble of details, and the world he craves, a well-governed realm. To fuse infinite multiplicity into perfect oneness. Tolstoy's integral fails as science, but I think it succeeds as metaphor. In the scheme of things, humans are so small that they're almost infinitesimal, and so numerous that they're almost infinite. And yet, each adds up. When we add up each of these individual humans, you get humanity. By this logic, history does not belong to any group or to any subset of us. Not to kings, not to presidents, not to warrior goddesses named Beyonce, not to any single lady, but to all the single ladies. History is the sum of people living it. This yields no scientific prediction, no mathematical law. Rather, it is a poetic truth, an artistic truth, a kind of truth that in an all-encompassing integral ought to matter every bit as much.